Good morning. Let us resume our discussion of Mahesh Dattani's plays. In the last session, we looked at one of his plays called Final Solutions, where the play is really about the main characters Ramnik and his daughter Smita, who come from a liberal Hindu family, and they have to negotiate with two extreme ends of religious orthodoxy. So, on one hand, you have Ramnik's wife Aruna, who is a very orthodox Hindu who observes rites of purity and pollution, and is unwilling to give water or feed the Javed and Bobby who are visiting, who are actually escaping from a bloodthirsty mob that wants to kill them, that accuses them of conspiring against Hindus. So she is unwilling to actually give them anything because she does not like to feed or share her domestic space with people who belong to different castes and other religions. And on the other hand, you have someone like Javed, who is this young, idealistic, rebellious Muslim man, the brother of Smita's classmate Tasneem, who wants to, who actually finally confesses towards the end of the play that he was the one who actually triggered the riots between the Hindus and the Muslims. And so he takes responsibility for it, and he said that he's the one who is the one who actually triggers the riots between the Hindus and the Muslims. And they were actually not, they were lying about being, chased by a Hindu mob when Javed tells Ramnik that I am the mob. You can't separate me from the mob. There's no difference between me and them. What I do and what they do is the same thing. We both create violence and unrest between Hindus and Muslims. It's just that I do it in a different street and they do it in a different street, right? So he confesses that he is and he even identifies, Javed even identifies with Aruna, saying that they are both two ends of the same spectrum of communalism and fundamentalism. And you also have another intersecting narrative in Final Solutions, which is the story of Hardika, the grandmother, and there are constant flashbacks in the play which suggest her memories of partition, of how for the longest time she thought that the Muslims were actually responsible for killing her father during partition. It also describes her friendship with Zareen, a Muslim woman whose father owns a fabric store, and the fabric store ends up getting burnt by Hardika's own in-laws. Right? So Hardika and Daksha are two interchangeable characters. Daksha playing the young, the youthful version of Hardika. Right? And so they realize that she finally discovers that it was her in-laws who actually burnt Zareen's father's shop and bought the shop from him at half the price. So she discovers later on that her family had refused to give Zareen's father a job or give him a loan to restart his business. Right. So, and you also see another transformative moment towards the end of Final Solutions, where Bobby, Javed's brother-in-law to be, the man who is engaged to be married to Tasneem, he's the one who actually holds the idol of Krishna towards the end of the play in his hand to test Aruna's faith. So the entire play really is about the negotiation of Hindu liberalism with conservatism, orthodoxy, fundamentalism, and it really is testing the limits of what it means to be a liberal Hindu, right? And so the play, in fact, is quite relevant in considering that it was performed in '89 and also before the whole Mandir, Mandal, and Masjid controversy. So it's an important comment on the very fraught and complex relationship between liberalism on the one hand, and on the other, fundamentalism and communal violence. So Aruna again is also forced to transform, compelled to transform herself. She actually realizes that she has to practice greater tolerance, and she believes now. In towards the end, she says that she believes in the plurality of faiths, that there are many ways to God, and that again becomes a very liberal standpoint, right, from one who is quite orthodox and puritanical. And Smita, the daughter, also confesses how she has been suffocated by her mother's piety, but that she tolerated her, despite the fact that her mother tried to superimpose her own Vaishnava faith in Lord Krishna onto Smita. And Hartika also discovers towards the end that it was from her son, she discovers that it was actually her in laws who created the violence. So every character in the novel undergoes a certain transformation. Even Javed realizes towards the end that he hates his life. That unlike Bobby, who never identified with being Muslim, he was also ashamed of belonging to his community for the violence that they had committed. But now Javed also confesses that he has led a meaningless life by creating unnecessary violence that has killed many innocent lives. So let's go on to the next play, which is another very important play by Dattani called Bravely Fought the Queen. Right, and of course the title of the play itself is an allusion to Jhansi Ki Rani, which becomes an important allusion towards the middle of the play as a symbol of female emancipation, female freedom of a certain kind. But although this freedom also is couched in extremely masculine terms, right? So what it means to be a free woman is probably to take power into your hands and to be able to position yourself as a very as self-owning, independent, self-determining, brave, manly woman, right? And so that becomes one of the motifs or symbols in the play. The play itself is actually quite densely plotted because there are quite a few characters, and there are lots of secrets that are revealed by the end of the play, which reveals the hypocrisy of institutions like the family. Right, so you have certain norms that have to be obeyed and that have to be adhered to when you belong to a family, but then that by the end of it becomes a sham, right? It's exposed for its hollowness by the end of the play. So it begins with a complete outsider to the family. So you have two brothers. You have Jiten and Nitin, who own and live in twin houses in this very posh locality in Bangalore called Koramangala. The entire play is shot set in Bangalore, and they both own twin houses in Koramangala next to each other. Two brothers are married to two sisters, Dolly and Alka. And Dolly and Alka have a brother called Praful, who never actually appears on stage but is constantly being mentioned and then becomes the focal character of the play by the end, even though he never appears on stage. And you have Ba, who is the old mother of Nitin Jitin, who lives upstairs. And if you remember the very complex and elaborate stage settings that Dattani has, which suggests a layered stage that can be mapped onto the layers of the human psyche, and it also does a very interesting play with time and temporality. So just like the previous play where you have two intersecting narratives, one of Hardika / Daksha, and on the other hand you have the narrative of the Ramniks and the encounter with Javed and Bobby intercutting on and intersecting each other. Similarly, you have another intercutting form in this play where you have Ba, who is living upstairs in Dolly's house, and she's always in bed, and she probably has dementia because she's losing her memory. She only has memories of or probably she has Alzheimer's, and she only has memories of her son's youth, but she doesn't remember. She doesn't always clearly remember what's happening in the present. So her constant calls for help or her constant calls to Dolly and Alka interrupt the main narrative of the play. And you also have the main scene, which is set in Dolly's drawing room, where Dolly and Alka of course is in the neighboring house, and initially a lot of the what's happening in the play is not very clear. We only have suggestions that of these sisters being rather lonely and isolated and uncomfortable in the family they're married into. They don't seem to be entirely. They don't seem to have a very harmonious and loving relationship to each other. We sense that there are lots of animosities, hidden animosities and secrets that will probably be revealed across the course of the play. The initial act, just to go over a summary of the plot. You have an outsider called Lalita, who doesn't belong to the family, and she is the wife of Sridhar, who works for Nitin and Jitin. And Nitin and Jitin run a business, which they not a business, but they actually run an advertising firm, which is on the threat of becoming bankrupt, right? So it's a fast failing business, and they're struggling, they're desperate to actually keep it afloat, for which they need money. And they need Sridhar also because Sridhar is one of their assistants who needs to get the this new account. He called Revati, right? And Revati is a new range of color coordinated nightwear and underwear for women. And Sridhar has been, given the responsibility of finding funders, people who will, clients, important clients who will sponsor and fund this campaign. And his wife Lalita has been asked to organize a masked ball with Dolly and Alka, and she wants Dolly to suggest costumes for the actors, since or the models who are going to be acting in the new ad campaign, since Dolly seems to have some experience with tailoring and stitching women's clothes. So there seems to be a misunderstanding in the beginning of the play when Lolita meets them, and Dolly is not expecting her at all. She's not sure why she's here, and then there seems to be a mix-up in the dates. But then the mix-up also becomes a pretext for them to actually discover, for Lalita to discover a lot about the secrets, the hidden secrets and animosities and hostilities of the Trivedi family. So Dolly seems to be a fairly very irritable and guarded woman. She's emotionally distant. We don't know much about her, and Lalita is trying to understand her, but is not able to. It's interesting that the scene begins with the Dolly, wearing with Dolly's face completely covered by a face pack. Right, so she's wearing a facial mask for her skin, and she's not unable to talk very much or move very much for fear of cracking the makeup on the face, and so she's not able to. So she's wearing a mask, right? So it's interesting that she's literally wearing some kind of a mask, a face pack in the first act, suggesting, as it were, that she has lots of secrets, hidden desires, hidden animosities which cannot be revealed. The brothers, as I mentioned earlier, Nitin and Jiten, are living in large twin houses in Koramangala, which is a posh locality in Bangalore. And there's the other character who does not appear on stage, which is Daksha. Daksha is Dolly and Jiten's daughter. And Dolly seems to be someone who is rather lonely and isolated. I mean, rather seems to be quite a neglectful mother. She doesn't really know where in which school Daksha goes to. Right? She just vaguely knows that she goes to some school in Ooty, but then where in Ooty she has no idea. And Alka and her sister Dolly both seem to be lonely and isolated and trapped in the house, looking after their poor mother-in-law, who seems to have lost her memory. There's some confusion and miscommunication over the dates, and Lalita, suddenly feels very confused and flustered, and feels rather unwanted in a house, especially because she's come on the wrong date, so she feels like an unwanted guest, and she also senses the hidden animosities between Dolly and Alka. Dolly, later on, we discover over the course of the play, over the conversations that Dolly and Alka have, that Dolly seems to be a lot more reticent, not a very friendly woman, not very outgoing, unlike Alka, who seems to be a lot more social and gregarious, in her behavior. And Dolly also seems to be jealous and resentful of Alka, because Alka seems to be far better informed about their family plans. Right? She doesn't seem to know much. She feels that Alka is the one who gets to know first about any plans, any outings that the family is going to go on. So Alka is married to her brother-in-law Nitin. Dolly also is not the kind of person who seems to like talking to strangers at large impersonal parties. Right? So she's probably tired of leading the kind of the glamorous and wealthy life that her husband leads, which entails organizing and hosting large parties where one ends up being trapped talking to strangers. So she's probably a little, but she's also disappointed that she can't step out, because the mix-up of dates, since Lalita seems to have come on the wrong date and she had no idea of the masked ball, that she's now trapped at home, and she's disappointed that the outing is not happening. Right. So while she's dressing up and wearing her makeup, eagerly looking forward to stepping out with her husband, her brother-in-law, and her sister, They were supposed to go to meet the Kapoors, another important client, but then the party is called off, right? And so she feels rather disappointed that she can't step out. So the sisters seem to be quite, they seem to feel rather trapped in that house, in that large mansion, taking care of their mother-in-law. Then there are also certain other snatches of conversation between hints that are being thrown, peppered throughout the play between Dolly and Alka, and which reveals more and more about their shared history. So we discover that Alka is an alcoholic who drinks a lot and was also once thrown out of the house for insulting their mother-in-law, until her brother Praful convinces Nitin. So Praful and Nitin are college friends, and so Praful convinces Nitin to take his sister back, and Praful later also threatens Alka if she is seen drinking, or if she is seen having even the slightest, remotest affair with any other man. Right. So the suspicion is that Alka is probably, tired of her marriage. Perhaps she's having an affair with another man, although that's not entirely clear. But the fact that she's also drunk, she has no control over her drinking, and that she once also insulted her mother-in-law. And the other interesting symbol that recurs throughout the novel, throughout the play, is also that of the bonsai. Right. So Lalita, Sridhar's wife, who comes to meet Dolly and Alka for the masked ball, is known for her bonsais. So she makes bonsais, and bonsais, as we know, have to be stunted to grow to its limited size as a miniature tree. Right. So the roots have to be tied up. And they have to be given just about enough space that the bonsai does not actually grow into its normal size. So the bonsai perhaps also becomes a symbol of women's lives, especially women who have suffered patriarchy, right? And that becomes clear because later on we discover that Ba, the mother-in-law, through her snatches of her memories of her youth, we discover that she was ill-treated and beaten up by her husband, and so she seems to suffer the same fate at the hands of her husband that, in some sense, Dolly and Alka also later seem to be facing at the hands of their husbands and brother. So that the common motif that links the two narratives of Ba's narrative of her youth, of her violent marriage, with Dolly and Alka, is one of patriarchal violence, right? Domestic violence. There's another character who's mentioned who never actually appears on stage, which is Kanhaiya. And Kanhaiya is the young replacement of the temporary cook who works for Dolly. And we later discover that Kanhaiya does not exist. Right? So we think that he exists, that he is present somewhere, but that he actually ends up being just an invention of Dolly's imagination. Right? So he's just a fictional character who symbolizes, who embodies Dolly's fantasy, erotic fantasy. She imagines him as someone who is young and dark and attractive and desirable. And then you also have Daksha, who's Dolly's daughter, who never actually appears on stage, but later we discover that she is training to be a Bharatanatyam dancer, but that she's actually a young woman who is disabled. Right? So she has suffered certain disabilities. We discover later on why or how she became disabled, but now she is rather incapacitated, but is still trying. She studies in a special school for children with disabilities, and that she's trained to be a Bharatanatyam dancer. In Act 2, we again are given hints of Nitin and Jiten's advertising firm, which is suffering due to lack of funds. Nitin and Jiten they have been given an interest-free loan from Praful, right, for the advertising campaign, and they decide to ask for 12 instead of the initial 10 lakhs, so that they can use 10 lakhs for the advertising campaign and spend the remaining 2 lakhs as interest, so that can be circulated as interest. And they don't want Dolly and Alka to know that their brother Praful has given them money. They, on the other hand, the brothers assume that Praful is an inferior fool who actually loaned them money without any interest. So they are actually quite shocked and amazed by and contemptuous of Praful for giving them a interest-free loan, and they just assume that he's doing it only because he wants them to remain married to his sisters. So Jitin and Nitin are struggling to keep the business afloat, and their only hope is to get the Revati account for female nightwear and innerwear. And they're not very happy with the way Sridhar, their assistant, is handling the account. The client apparently does not like their idea, which the client claims that their advertising campaign for for women's underwear and innerwear does not truly understand what women and what they want. Right, so it's not they accuse him, they accuse them of being of obscenity. They think that they are actually that their advertising campaign is quite obscene and sexualizes the woman who is dressed up in her rather attractive and seductive lingerie, waiting for her husband to come back from work. Right, so they have a problem with the open explicit obscenity of the advertising campaign. And then later on, Jiten, who was the older of the two brothers, Dolly's husband, also, we discover that Jiten is a very violent man. Right? He's not someone who listens to reason. He's someone who's always violent. He always erupts into violence and rage. And he suggests that the advertising campaign should target men instead of women, because if you target men who have the buying power to make their women look sexy, then that would actually be a far more successful campaign, right, than targeting women who may not have the purchasing power, and and so they are actually, after all, dressing up only to please their men. So the campaign, he believes, should actually target men who have the purchasing power to make their women look sexy. So as I mentioned earlier, you also have intercutting memories from Ba. So you have Ba's memory of her son's childhood, and which suggests that her sons were actually spoiled by their father. But she also reveals that she gave them whatever money little she had, she got from her father. For which she was beaten up by her husband. So, we realized that the husband, Ba's husband, was a violent man who probably did not give her much money, who just used her as a servant, as a slave. And Ba's only choice was to ask her father for money to spend on her sons. Jitin now wants to sell their ancestral home in Koramangala to pay off their debts in order to then get this Revati account. Right? Even though Nitin, on the other hand, is reluctant to give up the family home because of the memories, the childhood memories that are associated with the house. And Jiten, of course, is very upset that Sridhar agrees with the customers' feedback. When the customers say, probably when the customers are, of course, women, and so when they feel that the campaign is rather obscene, Sridhar agrees with them, but then Jiten doesn't. And so Jiten nearly fires Sridhar for disagreeing with him. There's also a past incident of road rage which suggests that Jiten's driver had nearly killed an auto rickshaw driver. Right, so Jiten's driver had driven the car across over the auto rickshaw at night. Luckily, the driver was not in the auto rickshaw, but then he was waiting in a shop while the auto rickshaw was parked somewhere. And when Jiten's driver just tried to drive past the auto rickshaw that he had just mowed down, the driver came in search of Jiten's driver, but Jiten's driver manages to actually drive on with the auto rickshaw driver holding on to the window. So when the auto rickshaw driver does not let go of the car, the driver actually embraces his neck with his arm, and and tries to strangle him. Right? And so there's this incident of class arrogance, and so that again becomes a suggestion of Jiten's violent character, something which he seems to share with his father, somebody who is extremely violent and arrogant. Ba also clearly does not seem to like Alka because she thinks that Alka is a promiscuous woman, a woman who is an alcoholic. And Alka doesn't have a child also with Nitin. And Ba thinks that Alka is devious like her mother. Right, so there's another suggestion that there's something different about Alka and Dolly's family. we discover later that Alka and Dolly's mother was a singer and dancer. Right, so this is of course during just post independence, when it was still, when the very idea of a woman singing and performing and dancing was shunned and stigmatized. And so Ba does not approve of Alka and Dolly's mother, who was someone who was a performing singer. Jiten also tries to conceal the fact that Praful gave them money, and he lies to Dolly saying that Praful actually owes them money. And then Jiten also makes Sridhar. Jiten of course lies to Sridhar later on, saying that he and Nitin pick up sexual escorts in their office, and so he then later on forces Sridhar to pick up a sex worker for him and bring her to the office. So we discover from these different moments in the play that not everything is fine, that the family is also is on the verge of collapsing. The marriages are on the verge of collapsing, and that nobody seems to be quite happy in their marriage. Right? So Jiten also seems to be somebody who is having sexual affairs, with complete impunity, and doesn't care about what his wife thinks, and also forces his authority on Sridhar and makes him bring him a sex worker who will give him pleasure. We also then later on discover towards the end of Act 2 that the house, the ancestral home that Jiten wanted to sell off to redeem his debts and to get the Revati account, has been willed to Daksha. Right? So Daksha is the only heir of the family, and she is Dolly and Jiten's daughter. Right? So Nitin tells Jiten that he learnt from Ba that she had willed the ancestral home to Daksha. And now Jiten is helpless. He does not know what to do about it. And he wants Nitin to actually leave Alka, right? Because she's an alcoholic, and she is probably having affairs with other men. So Jiten thinks that if Nitin divorces Alka, he will again win Ba's approval, right? Because Nitin was always Ba's favorite son. He's the one who is described as someone who is gentle, who is fair skinned. The husband, so Ba is fair and like Nitin. Nitin has taken on her Ba's looks, complexion, a gentle person. Unlike Jiten, who's like his father, who's dark complexion, who's violent, who's authoritarian. And so Jiten assumes that if Nitin leaves Alka, uh, he will again win Ba's favor, because Ba does not like Alka. Right? So that's what he compels Nitin to do. He orders Nitin to abandon or to divorce Alka, right? So that they can get the property back from Ba. And in Act 3 again you have the revelation of some more secrets, where under the effect of alcohol, so the two sisters are sharing a drink with Lalita, who doesn't drink very much. And under the effect of alcohol, many other illicit secrets and desires emerge. So the women, of course, this becomes an opportunity for them to actually imagine the possibility of playing a transgressive role. So this allusion to Subhadra Kumari Chauhan's poem on Jhansi Ki Rani comes here, where Jhansi Ki Rani again becomes, a symbol, a fantasy of female freedom from social strictures, oppressive norms of family. So Alka imagines herself as being Jhansi Ki Rani. Dolly wants to be a Tawaif like probably their mother was. Someone who can sing. In fact, they keep playing the songs of these Thumris by Nena Devi, and that itself becomes a symbol of a transgressive symbol of the female voice, of the female singing voice, right, that sings. So this whole idea of singing and performing, in some sense, is an act of exposing, visibilizing oneself within before the patriarchal gaze. And then Alka suddenly begins to start dancing in abandon in the rains, right? And so there's a brief sense of freedom that she seems to have as she dances in the rains with her clothes getting drenched. So Daksha, later on we discover, is the heir of the ancestral home, and we also learn that she is, as I mentioned earlier, she is a child. She's a disabled child, and so we discover that she was not born disabled, right? And we also discover that Praful has been made the trustee of the house, right? So Ba seems to constantly ask for Praful, despite the fact that she's losing her memory. She remembers Praful, and we now know why she always wanted Praful, because she thought that Jiten would never be a kind and giving father, considering he was violent like his father. Ba believed that Praful was the only person who would love and take care of Daksha. So she makes Praful the trustee of the house, and not Jiten or Nitin. And Nitin, of course, also because he got married to Alka, whom she does not approve of, that she realized that Praful was the only person who could actually be the trustee of the house. And we later discover from Ba's cousin, who tells her that Alka and Dolly's mother was their father's second wife, if not wife, at least mistress or keep, right? So we discover that the mother was a singer who was not probably legally wedded to their father, who was already married. And so there is that stigma of belonging to a family or a lineage of female singers, right? And an illegitimate marriage, right? So the Ba seems to not approve of that. That Dolly and Alka's mother was a singer who was not legally wedded to their father. We discover that Jitu had, in one of his violent rages, had actually beaten Dolly up when she was pregnant, shortly after their marriage, and it's because of that incident that she ends up giving birth to a premature and disabled daughter, right? And so Jitu is feels terribly remorseful and guilty for having produced her, for having threatened his daughter's life, right? And so a lot of the love and affection that goes towards the Daksha by Jitu is out of sheer guilt and remorse. We also discover that Nitin was having an affair with Praful. Right? So there's another secret which is revealed, that Nitin was married to Alka for sheer convenience, so that he could actually further his relationship with Praful. And so we realize that there was an illicit affair between Praful and Nitin, and that Praful had married Nitin, tricked him or forced him to marry Alka only for the convenience sake, and that probably now Alka realizes that, knows of the affair, which is why she longs to be out of the marriage. That she feels that she's trapped in a completely loveless marriage. Kanhaiya also, we discover, was a made-up fantasy by Dolly, who seems to have been utterly trapped in a loveless and violent marriage, and she also finally walks out on her husband towards the end of the play. And the auto rickshaw driver, who we also discover, there's a scene where the auto rickshaw driver, Lalita, discovers the auto rickshaw driver climbing the wall of the house at night and walking towards sees him going towards the outhouse, towards the back of the house. And there's a suggestion that probably Nitin was having an affair also with the auto rickshaw driver. We see that the play, in some sense, slowly, gradually unravels secrets that expose the hypocrisy of familial intimacies. That the family, which is supposed to be the most, the institution, the space, the emotional, affective space where the most intimate relationships are possible, that becomes, in fact, ironically, the very site of estrangement and alienation and violence. And we see how this occurs across the two intersecting narratives between Bao on the one hand, who was trapped in a violent marriage, who had to resort to her father to get money for her children, and Jiten, who, like his father, has a rather violent relationship with his wife, and also is responsible for producing a disabled daughter, and and Praful, who threatens Alka. Threatens to burn her hair if she does not actually conform to being a good wife, while he conveniently has an affair with her own husband. Right? So you see the hypocrisy and the irony of patriarchy. So this is exactly where the play Bravely Fought the Queen ends. So this is our discussion of Bravely Fought the Queen. We'll now return with a discussion of another play by Mahesh Dattani, the last play which we'll be discussing, which will again deal with a similar issue that has to do with gender, gender, the social regulation of gender and sexuality, which is called Dance Like a Man. Thank you.